Thank you, members. I now give the call to the Honourable Sally Talbot.
Thank you, President. President, a few weeks ago, as I started to put together my thoughts about this final speech, my social media feed popped up with a link to the Monty Python sketch, the All England Summarised Proust competition. 7 volumes of Proust in 15 seconds. I know tradition grants me a bit longer than that for a valedictory speech, but aspects of trying to condense the last 20 years into one speech have seemed at times as daunting as the Proust challenge and not nearly as funny. I do recommend it to you, by the way. The other point about valedictories, of course, was always put succinctly by the first Labour president in this place, the Honourable John Cowdell, who observed that when you die and no current MP has a clue who you were, the only 2 speeches anyone will consult for the final Vale tribute in Parliament are your first and your last. Your first speech in this place is, as many members would remember, primarily a moment of pure terror. When I made my inaugural speech on the 24th of May 2005, it was within the living memory of this chamber that new members were rostered to speak on whatever matter came up on the notice paper, which led to one unfortunate person having to frame his first speech in terms of the Onion Bill. I referred to this in my first speech. Rereading it the other day, I had one of those "I wonder whether that's actually true" moments that occur quite frequently when you have 20 years worth of speeches on the public record. It turns out that it is. It's actually subsidiary legislation, and I must say that Clause 5 would have offered some quite tempting opportunities to expound on one's parliamentary aspirations, couched as it is in terms of, and I quote, "Onions shall be graded according to their quality and size as grade 1, grade 2, large, with a capital L, picklers, spring onions and bunched onions." But if I take that thought too much further, I would be succumbing to the bad angels. And just to prove once and for all that I do actually listen to the advice of the Honourable Sue Ellery, I've decided it's best not to go down that route. So at least in the 21st century, we've been permitted to frame our first speeches around the twin themes of where have I come from and why am I here? The things I found most disconcerting when I dared to go back and read what I offered as answers 20 years ago was how little the circumstances in which we do our politics have changed. We feel today as if something really significant broke at the end of last year, when the re-election of Trump in America brought crashing down the assumption that decency and fairness were foundational aspirations of democratic societies. It feels, as I say, devastating. Here in Australia, we're keeping that devastation at bay, but who really thought that in 2025, the second major party at the 2 general elections we've had in WA would run on an explicitly racist platform of refusing to stand with the Aboriginal flag and derogating the practice of acknowledging Aboriginal country? We couldn't live further away, yet even at this distance, the American oxygen being pumped into the extreme right wing has filtered through our politics. The battle lines have become evident even in this House, with some members using the Parliament as a tub to thump on issues like the rights of GLBTIQA+ community and the decriminalisation of abortion. As I say, this feels devastating. I expected to find that rewinding 20 years would be a reminder of how things looked in a happier time. In fact, of course, we have for several decades been grappling with the feeling that we live in an age of almost paralysing uncertainty. In 2005, we were trying to work out how to survive after the World Trade Center attacks and here in Australia, the collapse of Ansett. People's faith in their institutions was beginning to falter, and even though we'd survived the YK2 bug, you could almost feel the global financial crisis shimmering in the wings. Addressing this in 2005, I suggested that there were three guiding principles which we, as legislators and leaders, could employ to effect positive change in a time when suddenly nothing felt safe. The first was that rather than self-interest, we would do better to look to collective action, that we're stronger together, that the collective good is more robust and of infinitely more value than individual self-satisfaction. The second was the need to rise to the challenge of seeing that some of the things that appear to be threats might be transformed into opportunities by changes of focus or emphasis. And finally, I spoke about how we might help people make sense of the changing world so that everyone has the courage to make choices about the sort of life they want to live and build the relationships of trust and cooperation that make civic life worth living. Now, as I stand here to farewell my life as a parliamentarian, I can say with a sense of being true to myself that for me, these principles still stand. They have, in fact, guided me through every day of the last 20 years. I literally carry them around with me every day in the form of a quotation by the Polish philosopher Kolakowski, who wrote about what motivates the work of progressive activism. It's not fun, he says. It's not easy or rewarding or offering of easy victories or miraculous devices. Rather, he says, the motive is an obstinate will to erode by inches the conditions which produce avoidable suffering. I count myself as extraordinarily fortunate to have been able to channel this obstinate will into a parliamentary life. I admit it, I haven't loved every minute. I said that your first speech is a moment of pure terror, and when I'm mentoring young political activists, I always warn them that if you're doing your job diligently, you'll never lose that frisson of fear that goes with political performance. Are you in the right place at the right time? Have you brought the right speech notes? What if someone asks an incomprehensible question? A very wise person once admitted to me that their plan B when facing parliamentary question time was to fall off their chair in a dead faint. Public life is stressful beyond the imagination of anyone who hasn't experienced it. Especially for a country MP like me, it's also at times a lonely and exhausting life. And of course, the moment when your political and your private lives collide on the front page of Saturday's West Australian is not easily forgotten, especially when it happens on the very day that your brother gets off the plane from London and ends up wondering why his sister spends the whole weekend steering him away from anywhere that might have a newspaper on display. So I haven't loved every minute, but I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Because the truth is that if you're committed to the work of reducing avoidable suffering, there are few more effective places to be than in a parliament. Let me say some things about that work. I came into this place on the high of Labour's second-term victory in 2005. Second terms are never to be taken for granted, but the solid campaign structure that Bill Johnston and I, as State Secretary and Assistant State Secretary of WA Labor, put together between 2001 and 2005, delivered us a remarkably strong victory. I know that, like Queen Mary, there's something they'll find lying on Bill's heart when he dies. It won't be Calais, but I'll fully expect them to find a copy of a certain ad about Federal Treasurer Peter Costello's less than enthusiastic reaction to Colin Barnett's canal proposal. I will admit that the canal and the last-minute catastrophic costings error by the Liberals were very helpful, but we did run a great campaign, one of the happy consequences of which was that Bill and I proved that you can indeed find real and lasting friendship in the political realm. That first term was a great period, although probably marked out in a lot of people's minds by the resignation of Premier Jeff Gallop. I was in Salzburg when the announcement was made, with tickets to see the Marriage of Figaro at the festival that night. By the time the curtain would have been rising, I was stranded in transit in Japan, trying to get back to Australia to carry out my duties as caucus secretary. Jeff was a great leader, a true philosopher king, and I've often wondered how differently the next 19 years would have played out if he could have been persuaded to stay. I know he thinks that I underdid R.M. Hare in my book. If our paths cross again after my exit from this place, I might have a bit more brain space to explain why archangels only got a passing reference in Partial Reason than I had when he raised it with me 30 years ago at 5:30 one morning between laps at Somerset swimming pool. It was a very Jeff moment. On an intensely personal note, my recollection of the challenges of those first few years is indelibly marked by the death of both of my parents at the end of 2007. They died within a month of each other, first my mother, then my father. Some of you may remember that they were in the President's Gallery behind us for my first speech in 2005. My mother had been very ill for some years with a wicked and extremely rare neurodegenerative disease. In a way impossible to express at the time, but which some in this chamber will recognise, I had looked forward to spending some years with my father somewhere in the future. And it took me a long time before I could see that it had been the outcome which he certainly would have chosen. That period in government came to a crashing halt in 2008. Losing an election is a terrible feeling, and few of us who were there will ever forget those agonising 8 days between the 6th and the 14th of September 2008, during which the National Party worked out whether they were more blue than red. They say that you learn the most about the effective use of this place when you're in opposition. I'm not sure that's true in every respect, but it was certainly the moment in which I sensed the really tough struggle begin. You work so hard in opposition because it is so awful. You're a loser in the eyes of the electorate. You have almost no resources. You spend all day and most of the night, week after week, month after month, and even year after year, plugging away at the arguments you're trying to make, forensically pulling apart every single thing the government does, while at the same time putting together a positive agenda for doing things the Labour way. I started clearing out my office here at Parliament House the same day that the Honourable Sue Ellery gave her valedictory a few weeks ago. Sue talked about how hard we worked during those opposition years. I had her comments fresh in my mind as I started emptying literally dozens of drawers, filled to the brim with all the files from those days. We didn't just line up for question time. We fought ferociously on every bill and motion that came to the House. We wrote legislation. We used our committee system, even as a minority party, to stop some of the worst excesses of the Conservatives. We even got the state constitution amended to include Aboriginal people in the preamble, all from opposition. It was a team effort, but I'm allowed just this once to blow my own trumpet a bit. As Shadow Environment Minister, I wrote the legislation for a container deposit scheme that our leader Eric Ripper introduced into the other place in 2011. The Liberal National Government had decided it wanted to wait for a national scheme, but we worked up a really powerful argument based on both environmental protection and community support that we simply couldn't wait. That bill was never going to go very far as a private member's bill, but I think it's true to say that it was a watershed moment in establishing that the states needed to act, which, of course, we did in 2020 once Labor was back in office. It was a similar story with plastic bags. It was Jay Weatherill, before he became the South Australian Premier, who advised me to make this a headline issue, again based on the fact that there was huge community support for a ban and the environmental benefits would be massive. To this day, I've never really understood what it is in the Conservative political agenda that makes them so implacably resistant to the introduction of things like container deposits and plastic bag bans. No one knows better than the Honourable Donna Faragher that my view about these things is very firm. I remember having a fairly heated discussion on the radio with the journalist Paul Murray about the availability of non-plastic dog poo bags. I have to say, I do think of Paul every time I'm cleaning up after our chocolate Labrador at the dog park. Anyway, we did eventually get the plastic bag ban too in 2018, once Labor was back in office. As a member of the Standing Committee on Legislation, chaired at the time by Liberal member the Honourable Michael Mission, who went on to become the Attorney-General, I spent 159 hours over the course of 39 meetings in 2010 and 2011, fighting the Liberal National Government's moves to introduce stop and search laws in WA, while disclosing nothing of the committee's deliberations. It is a matter of fact that I was the only Labor MP on the committee and the government had the numbers. Nonetheless, that legislation did not proceed, with the final report's first recommendation reading, "A majority of the committee recommends that the Criminal Investigation Amendment Bill 2009 be opposed." In my spare time during that period, I managed to get some significant changes to the parliamentary prayer. Believe it or not, we used to start each parliamentary day reflecting specifically about man and his fellow men, which seemed to me to be worthy of a bit of stirring. I wrote to the President, the Honourable Barry House, suggesting that there were 3 ways we could solve the man problem. The first, I suggested, accepted what I was pretty sure would be the argument of opponents of my cunning plan, that man is a generic term which includes women. It would read, "Almighty God, creator of the universe, giver of life, who has ordained that man of both sexes should live as a social being, seeking the fulfilment of his or her own true purpose within the society and sanctions of his or her fellow man of both sexes." I was pretty sure that would wake everyone up, paving the way for more elegant solutions. When I discussed this matter with my son, who was 25 years old at the time, his immediate reaction was that the best way to address the imbalance created by having had so many years of using male-gendered language was simply to swap genders, so that the prayer would read, "Almighty God, creator of the universe, giver of life, who has ordained that woman should live as a social being, seeking the fulfilment of her own true purpose within the society and sanctions of her fellow woman." While I remain very proud of having a son who is completely fearless about discussing gender politics, I did suggest to him that it might be safer to consider an option that would have rather fewer honourable members choking on their cucumber sandwiches. I know several members thought I was being a bit unadventurous in not moving to abolish the prayer altogether, But I was, and I remain of the view that with so little time in the modern world for reflection, it does nobody any harm to sit quietly for a few minutes and even focus for a bit on the responsibility placed on us by the institution of Parliament, not to forget who put us here and why. The non-gendered version of the prayer is now a sound component of the other gender-neutral procedural language which you, President, have introduced into this chamber, and I congratulate you for that. One last point about those opposition years. I talked about how awful opposition is, but there's a special designation of rewardlessness attached to the role of opposition leader. Imagine having a job where your sole criteria of success is to lose it. One of the reasons why we were able to be such an effective opposition during the first 3.5 years following the 2008 defeat was the leadership provided by Eric Ripper. I remember the assignments he used to give us. You couldn't take the teacher out of Eric. And while we would all have a bit of a grumble, he made us work hard, organise effectively, and never, ever lose sight of the fact that disadvantaged people needed Labour back in government. That wasn't to be, of course, with 2013 seeing us washed away again in the federal tidal wave. Actually, in my household, the 2013 general election was a time of considerable celebration. John was directing the Kimberley campaign, where the retirement of the sitting Labour member was making things somewhat tricky for Labour. I was working with the inimitable Mick Murray in Collie Preston. In the final days of the campaign, both of us got a call from the State Secretary. Having been a party official, I knew exactly what information the State Secretary has just been presented with before he rings marginal seat directors 48 hours before polling day to talk down their chances of holding the seat. I still recall where I was standing when I took his call and the discussion we had, or perhaps more accurately, the discussion I had with myself about how we'd been here before and held on, famously in 2001, when Mick won the seat by 34 votes. I went over how carefully we targeted our messaging, how Mick was brilliant at persuading people he was their man, even if they weren't that keen on the party, and how my calculation was that the demographic changes would ultimately play for us. When the State Secretary rang John, he got a rather different response. John told him that whatever his data was telling him was wrong. Here is John's account of how the conversation went. Whenever passing a living water spring within the central Kimberley area, I would always stop to pay respects to this ancient special place. On this occasion, a hot, humid and still day, I pondered whether I'd done enough to deliver victory for my candidate. In that moment, suddenly, the still hot humidity gave way to a gentle, cooling breath of air as a melaleuca tree branch brushed across my hand, releasing a few leaves. It left me with a feeling of calm and confidence that all would go well and victory was assured. I was never quite sure how the poor State Secretary reported that conversation back to the campaign committee. But suffice it to say, we ended up winning both seats. It was later in 2013 that I had my only serious crisis of faith about what I was doing as a Member of Parliament. Nothing would be served by going into detail here, although I did make a clear enough statement at the time. What prompted the crisis was finding myself at a clear line in the sand moment, and it was not a situation that I could sustain. It's not something I'd wish on anyone, but I will say that if you find yourself there, I hope that, like me, you find a resolution that will enable you to stand up 12 years later, completely confident that you did the right thing. My loyalty to, indeed my love for the Labour Party remains intact to this day, and I'm proud beyond words of the work we've put into building the Labour Party back into the entity it is today. There's a lot more I could say about that second term in opposition, but I'll adopt the approach taken by other members in their valedictories and simply say that can wait for the book. After I'd made the decision in 2013 to step down from the front bench, various friends were generous with their advice. I first met the Honourable John Cowdell in 1983 when, can you believe it, we were both 29 years old. He gave me my first, albeit unpaid, job in the Australian Labor Party. I photocopied all the policy documents for the February 1983 state election. We've been friends ever since, although I have warned him about constantly referring to himself as being younger than me. 63 days simply does not count. John's reaction to the news of my stepping down from the front bench was to present me with a copy of an instruction course called Belly Dancing the Basics. Suffice it to say that although I didn't actually take his advice literally, what I did do was enrol as a student at Alliance Française in Perth. I'd always had the greatest admiration for people who seemed to be able to have a life outside politics, as well as maintain the highest degree of commitment to their job. Jim McGinty was a fine example with his love of diving. And I'm glad to hear that as part of their induction to this place, new MPs are advised to always make some time to take care of their own fitness and psychological well-being. Giving myself permission to cultivate a different part of my brain and live a little bit of life outside the professional realm was a watershed move, and one that I seriously recommend you embrace if you value your sanity. I'd studied French at school, starting from the age of about 7, when I was part of an experimental class teaching children a second spoken language at a much younger age than was current practice at the time. When I was 10 years old, my father took me and my first brother across the channel to Dieppe for a week, and I will never forget my unmitigated joy at being there. It was like switching the picture from black and white to colour. I've never lost that feeling of wonder and fascination for France and the French. So I started the placement test on the Alliance website, got no further than Je m'appelle Sally, and enrolled in a beginner's class. The years since have brought me enormous pleasure and a great sense of achievement, which just about offsets the most incredible amount of stress I took on when I was one of a group of overachievers who decided to torture ourselves by taking DELF exams. Best of all, I've made some fantastic friends, some of whom are here this afternoon. Thank you, Sue Birchall and Jane Crisford, for providing the islands of sanity over the years. I'm looking forward to keeping our friendships going as my islands get a bit bigger post-parliamentary life. There was one last highlight of that period. I mentioned Paul Murray earlier in a context that some may have seen as not entirely flattering. So let me now say that I became a devoted fan for nearly the whole week after his Saturday column exposed the extraordinary attack mounted on the RSPCA in 2015 by some former members of this chamber. As the only Labour member of the 2015 Select Committee, chaired by the shooters and fishers before they found the farmers, I happily joined with WA Greens member Lynn McLaren to publish a lengthy minority report on the issues considered by the inquiry. This is how Paul Murray described the exercise. In a long career of following parliamentary inquiries, I've never seen a minority report that so categorically collapses the foundation of the majority report as that written by Labour's Sally Talbot and the Greens' Lynn McLaren. The minority report dissented from all but 12 of the 56 findings and 7 of the 26 recommendations, while also providing a robust defence of the organisation's operations from the same evidence. They left Committee Chairman Rick Mazza from the Shooters and Fishers and fellow majority members, the Nationals Paul Brown and Liberal Nigel Hallett, all representing significant farm interests, holding a weather when they wanted a ram. That, I think it's fair to say, felt like a job well done. 2017 finally brought the outcome that had at times seemed so remote during those long years in opposition. I'll never forget those first moments when the booth results in Collie Preston started coming in. I got quite grumpy with the first scrutineer who called me with numbers for Labour that gave us 57% of the vote, assuming that he'd done some kind of fancy maths to project a two-candidate preferred figure. When the next half dozen booths confirmed that we were actually winning on the primary vote, our greatest challenge was to convince Mick that he could come out of the bunker into which memories of 2001 and his 34-vote win always forced him on election night. What opportunities now opened up to us as we contemplated that first term in government? Very soon after the election, a group of us started working to respond to the strong wishes of the Western Australian community to have voluntary assisted dying in our state. Whenever I talk about those early days of the debate, I always start with the story of one of the information sessions we ran during the inquiry period, which was led by a North American medical practitioner who'd been involved in the practice of assisted dying for many, many years. These sessions were an important part of demonstrating to the wider community of lawmakers, many of whom had yet to arrive at a conclusion about expanding end-of-life choices, that introducing assisted dying would not eventuate in the sky falling in. This man opened his remarks with the observation that it is an indisputable fact of history that 100% of people who have ever lived have also died. It was a brilliant way of diffusing the tension in the room. But even more importantly for me, he summed up what we were trying to do with this new law. Because what was at stake for all of us who were driving the debate was not whether we should allow someone to choose between life and death, but whether we should allow someone who is dying to choose how and when they die. I will never forget the magnificent support we got every inch of the way from Roger Cook in his role as Health Minister. Amber Jade Sanderson chaired the Select Committee with a steely determination that really should be recorded for training and coaching purposes. Her role didn't stop with the conclusion of the inquiry, and there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that we owe the robust nature of the law which passed the Parliament at the end of 2019 largely to her. We weren't the heroes of that story, though. What shines out for me is the testimony we heard from people like Noreen Finn, whose partner, Clive Deverell, knew that by dying on Election Day 2017 and leaving a note saying suicide is legal, euthanasia is not, he could at least ensure we started having a serious conversation. William Phillip told us about how after his dying wife swallowed all the opiates she'd been prescribed for a serious back injury, they lay down together to wait. 4 days later, he called the ambulance, totally unable to bear the distressing condition of his wife, after 4 days of unconsciousness had not ended in her death. And Belinda Tay ensured that her mother's excruciating death, after many weeks of terrible suffering, might finally count for something when she walked from Melbourne to Perth to highlight the reality of what palliative care specialists call the nightmare cases where pain cannot be mitigated. The time I spent serving as a member of the VAD Implementation Leadership Team and, most recently, as a member of the VAD Statutory Review Panel stands out for me as a contribution worth making. I spent time in England and Scotland at the end of last year, working with advocacy groups on the legislation under consideration in those jurisdictions. The dedication and energy of proponents of VAD never cease to inspire me, and I look forward to seeing governments into the future ensuring that adequate resources and support are available to the many teams and individuals working as VAD providers in this state. The other issue to which I've devoted a great deal of energy since WA Labor has been in office is assisted reproductive technology and surrogacy. Bringing our state's legislation into the 21st century has been a mammoth task. I'm not proud, and nor should any member of this Parliament be proud, of the fact that WA is the only state to remain non-compliant with Commonwealth sex discrimination and equal opportunity laws. The work of the Ministerial Expert Panel, of which I was a member, clearly shows the way forward. And I join my friend and colleague, the Honourable Peter Foster, in hoping that legislation to remedy this situation will be coming into this Parliament before too long. Putting together legislation which is clear, inclusive, and solidly evidence-based is well within the wit of this place. And I urge anyone who is not certain that these changes should be made to actually listen to people's accounts of their lived experience and what is needed to ensure the continued well-being and security of children, partners, and wider families. And that, President, pretty much brings me to the present day. So let me end with a few comments about what the next 20 years might look like. The two elections we've had this year have given the Labor Party, both in this state and nationally, an opportunity to establish for at least the first half of the 21st century a foundation in which to embed the values we stand for. I've expressed those values in terms of being stronger together, transforming threats into opportunities, and empowering people by helping them make sense of a changing world. You will all have a slightly different way of talking about what you believe in, what matters to you. But the important thing is that your values have to be more than slogans on a T-shirt. You have to live and breathe them, and perhaps most importantly, recognise others with whom you have enough in common to band together. In that regard, I say confidently that WA Labor could not be in better hands with Roger Cook as our leader. Roger and I have known each other for 30 years. At one stage, we were trying to knock each other off to become State Secretary. Neither of us had a hope, and both of us had the sense to withdraw from the contest. I've always counted Roger as a friend as well as a comrade. He was, I think it's fair to say, as WA Health Minister, the unsung hero of the COVID period, and I have nothing but admiration for the way he bore the terrible stresses of those years and emerged smiling at the end of it. In winning so convincingly in March this year, he has reminded us that being open about and staying true to your values is one of the most vital elements of leadership, and he's well on the way to establishing himself as one of the great Labor leaders of our time. I said earlier that I love the Labor Party, but the Labor Party is nothing more than the people who come together as the Labor Party, who put into practice every day the belief that we're stronger together, that it's the webs of connection we constantly weave amongst ourselves that end up sustaining our energy and commitment to the cause. There's nothing soppy about this. I'm not on the all you need is love bandwagon. I've been a spear chucker most of my life, and I've been proud to be a warrior for the causes my union, the AMWU, has fought for under the leadership of first Jock Ferguson and then Steve McCartney. I've got enough scars and so have the people at the other end of the spears, to illustrate Kolakowski's point that being an activist is neither fun nor easy. But the Labour Party is more than the sum of its parts. It's our rank-and-file members, like Faye Slaven, Bill Hamlet, Renee Chappell, Lynn and Louis Warren, and Marjorie Shire, who plug away every year, keeping the red flag flying. Louis's death just last week is a great and sad loss, and I send our love to Lynn. I think our beloved Roy Scaife would still be proud of our Australian branch, even though his son depleted our numbers by defecting to Coburn. It's the Labour Party that frames our shining stars like Ellie Whittaker, who's about to begin yet another brilliant career as a senator. It's the Labour Party that provides the motive force for generations of younger activists with whom it's been my privilege to work. Claire Comrie, Ashley Buck, Andy Skinner, Tom Palmer, and Louise Holding, you'll always be Durack to me, top the list, but it's very, very long and includes everyone I worked with recently on the magnificently successful campaign to hold Scarborough, as well as truly inspiring people like Renee Portland and Darcy Gunning at the AMWU. And of course, there's our ace warrior, Louise Pratt, and David Scaife, whose eye for injustice is unparalleled, and whose exceptional talents will see him rise to whatever challenge he sets himself. Apart from the fact that I'm about to get on a plane to France, the thing that makes it particularly painless to farewell my parliamentary life is that Katrina Stratton is effectively taking my place. After we overcame the shock of finding the member for Nedlands in our Labour caucus after the 2021 election, we realised that we'd done quite an unusual thing in choosing a candidate for a presumed unwinnable seat who was actually a remarkably gifted political operator and, perhaps even more surprisingly, an outstandingly good human being. She was most definitely a keeper. She passed the initial replacement screening tests, of course. She has a PhD and she is a tea drinker. Over the next few years, she proved herself to be another true Labour warrior. And I know she'll make her mark on this place with her brand of progressive activism. There are several other people, either here today or watching online, who have helped hold the last 20 years together for me. As someone who was born in the other hemisphere, I have a found family here in WA. Ilya and Susan Senin have laughed and cried with me for more than 35 years. And the friendship of you and your whole marvellous family is one of the joys of my life. Jill Lowe is my oldest friend in both senses of the word. I said in my inaugural speech that Jill was the person who constantly stripped me of any airs and graces I tried to acquire. I reckon she's done a reasonable job, and for my part, I never ever tire of our long tea-fuelled conversations. Paddy Creevy, you've always been an inspiration to me with your inexhaustible energy and optimism and your genuine love of humankind. Jerry Garland and Steph Much, thank you for being there through thick and thin. We have nearly been neighbours so many times over the last 30 years, but just remember we're only 400 kilometres down the road. I feel extraordinarily lucky to have had so many people in my life about whom I can ask myself, at the many stressful moments that beset political life, what would so-and-so do? Perhaps the biggest single influence in shaping my direction since I was her student in the 1980s is Patsy Hallam. I don't know whether she remembers me asking whether combining politics and philosophy would be a sustainable life choice, or whether they would cancel each other out so that I was left with nothing. Even if she has, I've never forgotten her answer. She told me that whatever I chose, I must not stop trying to change the world. I'll never ask you to grade my attempt, Patsy, but thank you for being here today. I must also mention the great teams I've worked with in my electorate office over the years. As well as those I've mentioned already, I'd like to say a special thank you to the people who saw out all or part of the last term with me: Alison Sawyer, Tom Wolfe, Bronwyn English, and especially the irreplaceable and undauntable Louise Knox, who was my longest-serving team member. One last word about the challenges that we all, inside and outside parliaments, must continue to meet. The things that we as progressive activists value are, I believe, enshrined in our institutions, in our parliaments, our courts, our justice system, our places of worship and learning, our economic structures. But as we can see with the unravelling of American decency, it turns out that our institutions are only as robust as those who would defend them. As one American writer observed recently, our institutions are not, in fact, so mighty. They are vulnerable to anyone not in awe of them, not wanting the respect of them, to anyone willing to upend their processes. My fear is that we're losing the art of telling the story that cultivates that awe. We must never forget that our opponents, those who are happy to hitch their wagon to the practice of what Ezra Klein calls the politics of public cruelty, will wantonly fuel the fires of uncertainty to breed suspense and anxiety. Those of you who know your Screwtape Letters might recall C.S. Lewis's point about how suspense and anxiety barricade the mind so that people become obsessed not with what they do, but with what will happen to them. If you're worried about what will happen to you, you'll fritter away the energy you need to make civic life worth living. But focus instead on what you do and your obstinate will to erode by inches the conditions which produce avoidable suffering will thrive and flourish. To all my colleagues who are joining me in leaving this place, I wish you the very best. To those who are continuing or being sworn in for the first time on Thursday, I urge you to think always about what you do and not what might happen to you as you pursue the task of working for those who need us to succeed. And to the entire community that makes up the complicated world of the Parliament of Western Australia, I say thank you for your support and assistance over the years. To my beloved son, David Talbot, I say thank you for your love and company over the last 38 years. You've taught me most of what I know about life, and I'm joyful as well as proud to be your mother. To my darling husband, John Ford, I can only say that if we have half as much fun over the next 25 years as we've had in the last, our life together post-Parliament will be full to bursting with happiness. Someone asked me recently whether, as an activist, it was better to marry someone completely outside of politics or completely inside. I said that the only thing of which I was sure was that it helps if you love each other. On that score, I can't wait for the next chapter to begin. Thank you, President.
The Honourable Peter Foster.
This motion be adjourned to a later stage of this day's sitting.
Members, the Honourable Peter Foster has moved that way, and the question is the motion be agreed. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. The ayes have it. Members, before we proceed to the next order of business, we'll just give the chamber an opportunity to settle and members an opportunity to wish the honourable member all the best. Oh, you darling man. I think you're going to make me cry. I'm so grateful. So then, well, Sam will talk you through it, but actually, the Leader of the House is going to move a motion.
I think we're just going to flow straight into the next bill, which is the reserves bill. So, questions, we'll read a second time.
Okay, happy out. Thank you. Oh, I'm so stiff.
It's been a long sit.
Yeah, gonna get used to it.
Oh, yeah.
Don't get to see you anymore.